On this episode of EcoSense for Living, we explore the environmental justice movement and the importance of making sure that everyone has a seat at the table.
There's a perception that people of color don't care about the environment. But the challenge is that many of us feel like we can't do anything about it.
At the crossroads of environmentalism and social justice is a movement that's beginning to catch on.
People are often surprised to hear that NAACP is working on environmental issues. They often think it's disconnected with our bedrock civil rights agenda, people externally and internally, particularly in the beginning. When I first started to do the work, I did a couple of workshops at our regional gatherings that we have, and the workshop on the agenda was listed as Climate Justice 101. And so people came into the workshop, and the first time someone said, wow, Climate Justice 101. And when I saw this, I thought this was going to be about the climate of injustice in the world. And so they were really surprised when they found out that it was about climate change. And they said, you know, they really see how it relates to their communities. So it's interesting because a lot of people use different terms. They talk about vulnerable communities, or they talk about marginalized communities, or all these terms. And we want to kind of talk about the exposure, the disproportionate exposure, and we talk in terms of frontline communities. So whether it's coal-fired power plants, which are disproportionately located in low-income communities and communities of color, or oil refineries, or natural gas operations, they're all tend to be located in communities where there are lower property values, and communities where there's less political opposition, which tend to be communities that are politically disenfranchised.
So environmental justice focuses on the negative impacts of the decisions that affect our environment on people of color and poor people. Historically, folks who've come from those communities have suffered the most. And because of that, we have to be very sensitive to ensuring that the decisions that we make around our environment do not disproportionately affect them. We definitely have to care about the issues associated with climate change, but we also have to understand that, for example, because of our utilization of cars, that it has created bad air quality, and in particular for communities of color that live in urban areas. And so those communities have a high asthma rate.
A lot of what we have to do is really talk about how we need to redefine environmentalism to think more inclusively than the traditional perception of the environmental movement, which tends to be on, saving the whales or flora and fauna as opposed to families and so forth. And so we really say that we're all a part of the environment, humans, wildlife, and we're all interdependent, and we're all part of this ecosystem. I did a talk recently in a national park, and when it was being advertised, there were people who were perplexed and people who were actually opposed to having a conversation about environmental justice when they have historically, largely focused on kind of the traditional definition of conservation. And so they were about preserving the park and preserving the trees and preserving the wildlife. And they're very much questioning the integration of human rights into traditional environmentalism. Toxic facilities are disproportionately located in low-income communities and communities of color for a number of reasons. Some people talk about the chicken and egg, whether the facilities are there first and the communities come, or the communities are there and then the facilities built there. And really, it's both. And so when we talk about toxic facilities, it includes everything from landfills, coal-fired power plants, oil refineries, waste incinerators, even chemical plants, cement plants, manufacturing plants like paper mills. One of the misperceptions is the notion that people can just move. Why don't they just move?
Usually those high areas of pollution, in particular those plants, are the only form of economic development in those communities. And so they have access to jobs, but also too, where will they be able to move to? the housing costs are cheaper in those areas, but if they attempted to move into other places, it would be more and more difficult for them to afford to move. And so both of those cause challenges for those communities to move away from those toxic areas. Well, it has been a challenge in encouraging people to connect the dots. Usually when people begin to have conversations about environmental injustice, they also have to begin to have conversations about structural racism. For some communities, it's very difficult to have those conversations because if you begin to have those conversations, you have to begin the process also of acknowledging winners and losers and acknowledging your potential privilege in the way that the system has been designed. You know, another real challenge also has been around the way that traditional environmental organizations have worked. Having a collaborative spirit around this conversation is not historically where many of these traditional environmental organizations have started from. The other misperception that I've heard is that people don't assume instantly that the parents of children that live in those communities want the same things for their kids as other people want for their kids. They want them to have access to good food, good water, good air, and they want to have a good job in order to provide those resources for them. And also, the last thing is that there's a perception that people of color don't care about the environment. But the challenge is that many of us feel like we can't do anything about it, that the issue is too big, that we're just going to continue to accept the way things are. And so it is our responsibility as an organization and others to get people to understand that they do have say-so in making their communities better, and that if they come together and organize, that we can create a better tomorrow for themselves and future generations.
68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, which is considered to be kind of the zone of impact in terms of the pollutants that come out of those plants, which includes sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead, benzene, all of these things that have known extreme health impacts. When you start to know that, you start to see why it is that these various diseases and conditions are disproportionately located in these communities. So African American kids are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter into the hospital from an asthma attack and 2 to 3 times more likely to die from an asthma attack. Between the pollutants from a coal-fired power plant, and then they have cumulative impacts because they also have pollutants from near roadway air pollution more than other communities. So they're more likely to live next to a major roadway or a bus depot. 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of federal air pollution standards. African American adults are more likely to die from lung disease, but far less likely to smoke. And so we see where it's those toxic exposures that are affecting those families.
I come across pushback from individuals who may not be willing to reach for the human element of this conversation because it is very difficult for them to own the history of structural inequity and racism in our nation. For some communities, it's very difficult to see the communities that we care about as a critical part of our ecosystem. Dr. King used to have a term, the network of mutuality, that we're all bound by a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. Growing up as a child who lived in a city where Dr. King is such a towering figure on civic life was both sweet and bitter because every year we would celebrate his birthday for that one day and say that we need to honor this man who was a true champion for justice, who fought for the vulnerable and wanted to create an opportunity for all of us to come together as a human family. But then once that holiday is over, we still reside in a city that's number 3 for income inequality of any city in the country. A poor child in Atlanta only has a 4% chance of rising out of poverty in this city. 80% of Black kids live in high poverty areas. And so, you know, when we look at the numbers and understand them, we've got to begin to not only honor King on the day of his birth, we have to do what we can to ensure that we're living King's legacy. We live in a society where everyone does not start at the same place on the racing block. But what we all have an opportunity to do as a human family is to develop empathy. I mean, we cannot begin or continue to see the environmental justice conversation as the kids' table at Thanksgiving. You know, that we have to see it as a key component and a key part of the environmental movement. And that we have to also embrace the fact that the future leaders that we need for this movement will come from those communities that we have left behind.
One woman's personal journey led her to protect the environment and to help others get involved.
I'm originally from Mississippi, but grew up for a few years in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is an area that some people call Cancer Alley because of the prevalence of cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, and that sort of thing in this 100-mile stretch. And it also is home to over 100 or so chemical companies and pollution-generating facilities. And after living in Baton Rouge for a while, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was kind of a wake-up moment for me. It's not that we can connect, her diagnosis to anything that we may have been exposed to in the area, but just the fact that that possibility existed gave me the impetus to want to get involved. I began to make connections about the air quality. The air smelled bad, the water smelled and tasted bad, and I even remember, personally having a lot of splotchy sort of light colored spots on my skin that I never had before moving to Louisiana, and I didn't have after I left. So in college, I started out studying chemistry and chemical engineering. It was in a dual degree engineering program. After learning of my mom's diagnosis and just connecting the dots for myself, I decided that I wanted to be more solution-oriented. I wanted to be on the other side of that, and I wanted to work to help communities who may have been facing environmental health threats. So I changed my major and then went to graduate school to study environmental health. Everybody deserves clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, healthy soils through which food can be grown, access to healthy and affordable foods, access to parks and green space, and it should not be based on your race or your socioeconomic status. The West Atlanta Watershed Alliance is a community-based organization that works in Northwest and Southwest Atlanta in the Proctor, Utoy, and Sandy Creek watersheds, and we are working to, grow a cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable West Atlanta. The roots of the organization are around decisions around wastewater infrastructure in the city of Atlanta. The combined sewer system is one that was established in the city of Atlanta in the late 1800s, and so in some of the older, neighborhoods close to the downtown core, you still have this old system in place where you have one pipe that carries stormwater and wastewater to our wastewater treatment plant for treatment. And when the capacity of those treatment plants fill up, the system is designed to produce an overflow event of essentially raw, untreated sewage mixed with stormwater into a receiving creek or stream. And there was a decision in the early 1990s in which the city had decided to begin to try to address this challenge, that they needed to develop many wastewater treatment plants. And there was one slated for placement in John A. White Park, which is a park in Southwest Atlanta. We are talking about a community park where kids play, and the message that the community receives is that, it's not valued. That it's not important, that we can just dump on this neighborhood because they don't care or they don't matter. And the community decided that they needed to stand up to make sure that not only did this area not get this mini wastewater treatment plant, but that we actually separate the sewer system so that we wouldn't have the problem or challenge of raw, untreated sewage impacting the stream. It was important for residents of these three watershed communities to start an organization that would not only try to be corrective in trying to kind of put out fires, but that there was a force that could be proactive about advancing kind of a green, clean, and healthy agenda for the west side of Atlanta. We welcome you to our second annual West Side River Rendezvous. We are expanding that focus for the second year to 3 of our creeks on the west side, the Proctor, Utoy, and Sandy Creek watersheds, to get a picture of what water quality is looking like at this one point in time. The way that Wawa does its work is that we try to leverage the strengths and resources that everybody has, starting with the residents of our watershed communities. We know that they have intimate, local community knowledge and lived experience about these places, about the watershed. And so they know things that people, don't know, who don't live in these areas. And so you could, have researchers come out here and collect all of the water samples, by themselves and go back and, work in their silos. But there's something that you miss when you don't have the benefit of that local community knowledge.
There you go.
All right, so we're good. So this is an app that the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, in collaboration with members of the Proctor Creek Stewardship Council and students from Georgia State University, developed. And we call it our Proctor Creek Citizen Science app. And so we've done a lot of mapping in this area already and looked at some of these storm drains. Like if you just look across the street, you can see that storm drain it's kind of close to the ground. It's, sort of collapsing. And so when you have that type of infrastructure in place, sometimes there can be localized flooding events. But right now, what we want to capture is what we see here, kind of in the creek channel. Also, even if you look kind of catty corner behind us, look at all of that debris, which will be washed into the storm drains and find its way into the creek as well. So these are the types of things that we're trying to document. Let's go ahead and collect the data. So let's start with illegal dumping on land.
Is this app available yet to community leaders and homeowner groups and that sort of thing that they can start reporting on their own?
Our plans currently to take this beyond the pilot stage. More data is better, and having the data gives us the ammunition that we need to go talk with the city and other potential partners to get some of these issues addressed. And if we don't have them documented, our experience has shown us that we can't get any action. Just saying that there's a problem doesn't always translate into action, but if we can show actual data that the problem exists, then we have more leverage there.
It's disheartening and to see some of the litter and some of the trash that we experienced out there today. And that's really why it's important to get the local community involved. I'm encouraged mostly by what we saw today from the younger kids. There are a lot of college kids in that room that weren't forced to be here today. And if we can get the message through to the millennial generation and get them kind of invested locally and invested in their own backyards, then I feel like that's the message we can really reach the masses with.
Environmental justice is important because we want equality and we all want the same health benefits and we want to all combat the same health risk so that certain populations won't be more exposed than others. It is very important for people to volunteer and commit their time to making sure the environment is safe for all.
I think it's so important to realize that the environment is not something out there. It's here. We are a part of our environment, and our environment is a part of us. And what happens in that environment impacts us. So we just don't have the luxury of being only concerned about the wildlife and other species. And don't get me wrong, we are very concerned about all of that. But we have to, to recognize that people should also be safe and healthy where they live, where they work, where they play. So we've got to be concerned, about the role that both the natural and the built environment play in our everyday lives, in our health, in our well-being. And if we can look and work at those intersections, then we can have healthy, whole communities for people and all of God's creation.
The West Atlanta Watershed Alliance brings environmental education into the city.
So Wawa has really sought to create a pipeline that allows residents to speak in their own voice. So oftentimes, residents who are bearing this disproportionate burden are not asked if they can contribute into the solution development. And so what Wawa wants to do is to create that pipeline and create that, that methodology that allows residents to have a systematic way that they're able to participate and to publicly speak out in terms of their own quality of life. Watersheds are the land that supports the body of water. We're actually working on behalf of residents that live in proximity or live within the boundaries of the watershed. So we can talk about air, we can talk about land, we can talk about extraction and natural resources, we can talk about trees. So it allows us to have a deeper, broader conversation about the environment as a watershed organization. So this is one of the few urban nature centers that are in the city. Many of the urban centers, the nature centers, are oftentimes found in communities that are much more resourced. And so we still operate in a poor and modest means neighborhood. And so the services and the programming we provide are for the folks that live in this neighborhood, but oftentimes don't get the same kind of quality environmental education or opportunities to recreate in spaces or be seen in spaces that look like this. And so we really we strive to give high quality environmental education and content for those residents and youth especially that don't get the opportunity to perhaps go to your national parks. Everybody else? Everybody else get a chance to put your hand in the water? All right, so with this affirmation, all right, and as I mentioned, this was something that is a practice that the First Nations do as a recognition that we come from creation, we're part of creation. The facility where we're located is 26 acres, and it's inside of the city of Atlanta. We're probably, as the crow flies, about 10 minutes away from downtown Atlanta. And we're in a unique urban forest. So I thank you for sharing in this affirmation that we are connected to the peoples of this place. We're connected to the natural spaces of this place, and we're connected to the nature that we're going to encounter when we go outside. I think that young people are uncomfortable with nature, largely. And I think that, Richard Louv kind of mentions this idea of nature deficit disorder.
So the phrase nature deficit disorder, which I initially meant is almost tongue-in-cheek, people know it. They know what that is the minute they hear it. I mean, this is unprecedented, this disengagement between children and nature.
And I think that he's found that this is across the spectrum, that at every economic level, young people are disconnected to nature. So today we're actually going to work with a young people's group called Jack and Jill Association. And so these young people have come out, they've done some service learning with us. They've planted some hemlock trees. A really cool fact about Southwest Atlanta is that Southwest Atlanta has remnants of the old growth original East Coast forest. The old forest that used to go from Florida to Maine. We still have some of those trees. I think the broader issue with communities of color being able to access and connect to nature is that at first, conservation lands were for the elite. And so the perception is that you're not wanted. If you're never invited to come and participate in a space, you don't have any programming that's culturally relevant and culturally responsive to your needs, then you won't go. So I do think that that created the level of discomfort that now is part of the experiential makeup as to why we have to reconnect people to nature. So now you have less of perhaps the disdain for communities of color to access the parks, but because that has been so entrenched for so long, we have to deliberately make the connection so that people come in. Stinger bushes or greenbrier, right, have these little really soft barbs on them, okay? Now the barbs, they provide a function for the little chipmunks and the birds and things that forage on the forest floor. What's the benefit of having a plant that has these little stickers?
So nest make so the predators don't come and eat the little animals.
So what is that? If the predators can't get to them, what is that called? Protection. The questions they ask are, what's out here? And is there anything uncomfortable or do I need to be concerned? And so this idea that nature is unsafe is surprising and it's shocking. Because even as a young person growing up in urban New Jersey, I never felt uncomfortable being outside. And I was always able to play in our urban creek or stream and play in the woods. And so I think that making nature accessible to young urbanites, especially young people of color, has been kind of a mission of mine and kind of undergirds the work that I do as an environmental educator. Now, we also know that trees provide lots of benefits. What are some benefits that trees provide human beings? What else? Leaves. What else? Paper. What else? Trees will do what else? Furniture. Houses. What about food?
Fire.
Fire, right? I feel like I'm renewed every time we get another group out here. And so I think you're gonna see from the smiles and the faces of the young people that we'll have out here today that the work that we do as environmental educators is critical to moving forward the needle. There are probably lots of trees like Grandfather Beach in your neighborhoods. You might even have trees like this in your backyard, but you never thought about them in the same way until I introduced you to a beech tree. And now that you know that you can identify beeches, and you know that beeches can live as long as 150 years, and you've even suggested what could be done to protect them, I think you're well on your way to being a steward of nature and the environment.